Hey folks, and welcome to iWizard. So today I'm going to give you my list of the greatest legal novels of all time. Stay tuned. All right, welcome back. So the thumbnail here is a little bit misleading in the sense that this is going to be a list of what I regard to be the 10 best novels that essentially feature big, contentious court cases, legal battles, courtroom dramas, lawyers or judges as main characters, that sort of thing. So many of these will be legal thrillers, but some of them are going to be classics that come close to being legal thrillers, but aren't really like thrillers per se. So just a couple of quick rules before we get started here. I will not be featuring books that I guess could be categorized under true crime. There won't be any horror, no police procedurals. I'm not doing noir detective fiction. It's got to be fiction though, but it has to have a heavy courtroom drama or some kind of big legal debate at the center of the story. So that means, sorry, no Crime and Punishment. That book doesn't involve court dramas or trial lawyers or anything like that. They're pretty minor in the story because the detective, Porphyry, is not a lawyer. He's a cop. So with that out of the way, we're going to start with number 10. That would be 1987's A Time to Kill by John Grisham. So this book takes place in Mississippi. I was just down there visiting my brother Everett, actually, who goes to school at MSU. And I actually decided to read this book on the plane. So it's Clanton, Mississippi, and the story is about this terrible crime. A 10-year-old black girl named Tanya Haley is violently raped and beaten to a pulp by these two racist neo-Nazi Confederate goons. Their names are Billy Ray Cobb and Pete Willard. Soon after, they find the girl and she's rushed to the hospital and she survives. Meanwhile, Willard and Cobb are at this local bar and they're bragging all about what they did. And this is when the girl's father, Carl Lee Haley, he consults with his friend and our lawyer protagonist, Jake Brigance. Jake had previously represented Carl Lee's brother, and so Carl Lee is basically reaches out to him and wants to know what would happen if I killed these two guys to avenge my daughter's rape. And Jake is basically like, look, my advice is not to do this, but I have to admit, had it been my daughter, I'd kill the men. So Carl Lee goes to the courthouse as the men are being led into holding after a bond hearing and kills his daughter's rapists with an M16. And then, of course, he's charged with capital murder. So basically, the rest of the novel is about the tumultuous events that follow and the big trial where Jake and his goofy ragtag cobbled together team have to defend Carl Lee and try to get him off, even though Carl Lee can't afford to pay him. And as the case becomes a national, high-profile, big news case, Carl Lee is then being pressured to ditch Jake, who is a very small-town, not a very high-powered lawyer. He's being pressured to ditch him for more high-powered attorneys whose firms have more money. So there's lots of drama with the jury and the judge selection, the trial venue and racist factors, and the psychologists involved, KKK, intimidation and violence, all that stuff. The National Guard actually has to be called in at one point. So anyways, the novel is good. You're never bored for a second. Grisham's novels aren't like high literature or anything like that. They're basically fascinating, escapist beach reads. And I would also say this is nowhere near even Grisham's best novel. And the ending is, I would say, both predictable and a bit trite and maybe even a little unearned. And I would say, too, that some of the characters are a little unrealistic. I found the Klansmen actually in the novel to be cartoonish, right? If you're going to write Klansmen, make them seem real, right? These guys are like, yeah, man, I'm super pumped to burn some crosses on people's lawns. Yuck, yuck. right? So they're sitting around playing cards and they're like, we're going to do some acts of terrorism and they're going to be sorry they messed with the white race, right? So some of the characters are goofy, right? When this was supposed to have taken place, certainly there was a lot of Klan activity in a place like Mississippi, and it's important to tell that story, but they were a little bit caricaturish, I would say. And I would say, too, some of the storytelling is a little too convenient, right? Some of what happens is kind of unbelievable at times. For example, even the names, right? Like the judge's name in the trial of a black man who's being tried for vigilante murder. His last name is Noose, right? So a little too on the nose with some of that, but the premise is so good and the story is so gripping that it's pretty easy to overlook the aspects of the novel that aren't particularly well executed. One thing I do like about the book is that the main character, Jake Brigance, is not a Mary Sue or a Gary Stu, whatever you have it. He is a flawed character who's not even really a good lawyer at times, to be honest, when it comes down to it. But he's compelling, and the story's got a really entertaining edge to it. And I'll tell you something else. The closing speech in this book, the closing summary, Jake Brigance's final statement to the jury to close out this case is a masterpiece, and it's a tearjerker. I have to admit, I did shed some tears there on the airplane. Also, check out the movie A Time to Kill. It's really good, starring Matthew McConaughey and Samuel L. Jackson. So not bad. All right, and that brings us to number 9, another John Grisham favorite. That would be 1995's The Rainmaker. Yeah, sorry, I should say here that there are going to be 3 John Grisham books on this list. So this is the second one, and there will be one more. So The Rainmaker, I feel like this book does not get enough credit, and I think that's because the premise isn't super glamorous or shocking. It's a pretty run-of-the-mill story where a young lawyer who has virtually no experience finds himself taking on one of the most powerful and ruthless companies in America, and in the process exposing a complex multi-billion-dollar insurance scam that we learn is screwing over the poor. So the premise is pretty much boilerplate stuff, but the execution in this case is just divine. And it's kind of the opposite of A Time to Kill, which has a super original premise, but so-so execution. This book has excellent execution, but just a so-so premise, I guess you could say. So we're in Tennessee, and the main character, Rudy Baylor, has just graduated from this middling law school, Memphis State, with very average grades. And so he's desperate, and he ends up working for this guy, Bruiser Stone, this ruthless and crooked, but very successful ambulance chaser with ties to the mob, who eventually makes Rudy an associate. And to earn his fee, Rudy has to scout for clients at the hospital and convince them to sign up for personal injury lawsuits. So not an ideal, first job for Rudy. His odd partner is this guy, Deck Schiffler, who has a law degree and was an insurance assessor, but failed the bar exam 6 times and has some, I guess, kind of intellectual problems. So anyways, Rudy is working at this crappy place for nothing, and he eventually stumbles across this poor family, Dot and Buddy Black, and their son, Donnie Ray, who has leukemia. So the Black family has this insurance bad faith case that could be worth millions of dollars of damages, but then the firm that the protagonist works at is raided by the FBI, and so Rudy and Deck have to get together and set up their own practice and file suit for the Blacks, who are basically their first and only customers. So basically, the case is that Donnie Ray could have been saved by a bone marrow transplant, and his identical twin brother would have been the perfect match, but the insurance carrier, which was called Great Benefit Life Insurance, denied Donnie Ray's claim and refused to cover the surgery. Meanwhile, Rudy has just passed the bar exam himself, and he's obviously never argued a case in front of a jury before or a judge, and what's more, he is going up against the the wealthiest and most ruthless law firm, maybe in the whole entire South. So you get the picture. Inexperienced underdog David goes up against twin evil Goliaths, the wealthy law firm and the juggernaut insurance company. And while all of this is happening, Rudy is falling in love with this woman, Kelly Riker. She is a battered woman that he met while he was scouting for clients at the hospital. She's recovering from injuries inflicted by her husband, Cliff. Of course, his name is Cliff. And so even more predictably, Cliff comes after Rudy and all of that stuff. So there is romance and mystery. And anyways, I won't say any more about the plot. I'll just say that the story is fantastic. The insurance company here is so incredibly evil and also very believable. I can't even tell you. It's just so emotionally gripping and compelling. There's a man's life on the line. Millions in damages for the family and possibly millions for the protagonist are on the line. The story is slow building and very tense. This is literally, and I know everyone says this all the time, but this story is literally edge of your seat thriller kind of stuff. Lose sleep reading it in bed, one more chapter, all that sort of thing. So the pacing is perfect. The book is actually nice and long, so there's a lot of meat on the bones with this one. And I'll say it never gets boring. And Rudy Baylor is probably John Grisham's best character yet. He's easily the best that I've come across so far. And he's the character that Grisham said that he, quote, would like to be the most. And so I'll say that it is interesting that this book is so underrated because it sold 300,000 copies in its first few days, which made it one of the fastest selling novels in history at the time. And by the way, The Rainmaker was also adapted into a film by Francis Ford Coppola with Matt Damon, Danny DeVito, Claire Danes, Jon Voight, and Danny Glover. So just like a total powerhouse cast there. Anyways, check that one out. We are now up to number 8, 1990's The Firm by, wait for it, John Grisham again. So this is Grisham's second published book, and it's really the one that put him on the map as a novelist. So the synopsis, here we go. When Mitch McDeere graduates from Harvard Law School, he is one of the most touted and sought-after young tax lawyers in the country. He's being recruited by some of the most prestigious big-name firms in the country. From Wall Street to Chicago, Mitch and his beautiful wife, Abby, seriously consider all of these offers, but it isn't until he takes an interview with a small, unassuming Memphis firm, Bendini, Lambert, and Locke, a firm that pays way more and offers better benefits and perks than any other firm they've looked at, that Mitch knows he's finally found the firm of his dreams. Bendini, Lambert, and Locke offer Mitch a huge salary, a signing bonus, a new BMW company car, free vacations, fancy clothes, a low-interest mortgage. They even pay off his college debt. And so the offer is too generous for Mitch to resist. After signing, Mitch and Abby think they are on their way until Mitch learns that the firm is not at all what it seems. In fact, the firm is involved in a level of corruption and sin and creepy surveillance and cult-like evil, the likes of which shock the imagination. Now the FBI has the lowdown on Mitch's firm and needs his help. So Mitch is caught between a rock and a hard place. Either way, he must make a choice if he wants to live. All right, so I love the way this book was paced. So much suspense and tension. The story is set up so that you slowly learn more and more about this evil firm. Chapter by chapter, more is revealed. And one thing I found really gripping is that you go along for the ride with the main character as he gradually becomes more and more suspicious, right? He starts out completely wide-eyed and optimistic. He grew up poor and had family problems, so this firm seems like the perfect place. And then slowly he begins to learn more and more about the shadier aspects of the firm, how cutthroat his coworkers are, how intrusive the firm is when it comes to the lawyers' personal lives, the sheer number of hours you have to work, the questionable business dealings, the fact that so many people who have worked there have died in the recent past, and the fact that the FBI is watching them. And there's definitely other stuff too that I'm not going to spoil for you. Anyways, one of the best things here, I just really loved everything about the firm itself, just how creepy it is, how it's basically this weird secret society, the way that they spy on their employees and secretly track their lives. The fifth floor, which is like this secret locked part of the building that consists of a team of, well, I won't spoil anything there, but just the criteria that they use to select the new lawyers and the tactics they use to stay out of trouble, the money and the perks that they offer their lawyers so that even when they do find out what's going on, they never want to leave. And really, I guess, just the way they set the lawyers up and trap them so they can blackmail them. The headquarters, too, is like this evil, almost holdfast that they call the fortress. I should mention, too, that this is for Grisham a long novel, 527 pages, which is somewhat unorthodox for one of those sort of mass market thrillers for it to be that long. But it doesn't feel like it. Grisham does a really good job using the space to drag out the suspense and tension. And then at the end, the plot really tightens up, and the last 150 pages are just truly great. And if you've ever read Stephen King's On Writing, King actually praises this as one of the best modern novels out there, just in terms of the way it's structured and paced. I should mention, too, the FBI element. I love how the FBI in this book is like bumbling and kind of incompetent and corrupt. They can't move in on the firm without Mitch's help, and they keep making his job more and more difficult by getting in his way and almost getting him caught. And so I thought that Grisham truly got the FBI right in this story. You see so many movies where the FBI is like this top secret organization filled with the most tight-lipped, competent people who are just paragons of moral virtue and patriotism. And we all pretty much know the FBI, the CIA, DHS, these are pretty much just gangs with government badges. So that aspect felt really accurate. I like, too, the relationship Mitch has with his wife. Eventually, Mitch comes clean with his wife and tells her what he thinks is going on, and they kind of team up to figure out how they're going to deal with the firm and what they're going to do. And I'll say what Mitch does decide ultimately to do is really cool and a bit unexpected. I was not actually able to predict the ending at all in this book. So all in all, I'll say lastly that I like the theme here at the center of this novel of deciding to pursue the truth, even if it hurts, instead of living a life of corruption and lies. I always love that theme. Number 7, Presumed Innocent by Scott Turow. So this is the first book in the Kindle County series. The story is about this prosecutor, Rusty Sabich, and one day he finds out the assistant prosecuting attorney he works with and with whom he recently had an affair has been brutally murdered and maybe even raped. She is the victim of what appears to be some kind of weird sexual bondage encounter gone wrong, and she was killed by a blow to the skull. And so weirdly, he is assigned to the case because no one knows really he's had an affair with her. So he is the one who has to investigate this murder and try to solve the crime and find out who did it. But then, and here is the real kicker in the story, he's taken off the case because as it turns out, the newly elected DA has very compelling evidence that Rusty himself is actually the one who committed the murder of this woman, whose name is Caroline Polhemus. So he's charged with raping and murdering his partner, who recently had dumped him and who he'd been secretly having an illicit affair with. So Rusty has to lawyer up, and this thing goes to trial, and the rest of the book is about his journey through this trial, right? And they have got Rusty over a barrel here with lots of convincing circumstantial evidence. A bar glass with his fingerprints, sperm that looks like it might be his inside of the woman, carpet fabric that could be from his home, records of a call from his house to Carolyn's apartment the night of the murder, and even a possible attempt on his part to obstruct the investigation. And the great thing about this book is that it's got this really well done old school noir sensibility, this voice and tone. It's told from Rusty's first person perspective. And so it's very much subjectively from his point of view. And there's just a level of dark introspection and thoughtful inner monologue that I really have never experienced in a book like this before. And what's unique is that usually when you're reading one of these legal thrillers and you're inside of the protagonist's head, you know whether the guy believes he did it or not. it's a little bit more murky here in this novel, and you'll see what I mean when you read it. Another thing that's fantastic is that there are all sorts of twists and turns. Evidence goes missing. There's a possibility that Rusty is being set up by corrupt cops and lawyers and judges. So there's this whole conspiracy element to the book. It turns out that Caroline herself may have been corrupt as well. There are bribery schemes, and there's just so much going on. And the brilliant thing is that you realize all of this is kind of misdirection, and in the end, you get to find out what the real truth is. And let me tell you, this is probably in the running as being one of the best endings of any novel I have ever read, ever. It is definitely in the top 5 in terms of endings. It is astounding, totally shocking, jaw-dropping. It makes you want to read the entire book over again, and it's kind of what I did. I went back and reread the last, I guess, quarter of the book, so not the whole thing, just to make sure I understood what had happened and that no tricks had been played on me and that I was really understanding everything correctly. I've got to say, too, that this is not your run-of-the-mill John Grisham airport book, right? This book is brilliantly written. And I think we look back at it now, probably because most people remember the film version with Harrison Ford. But we look back at this book, I think, in our culture as just another one of those fun legal thrillers. But the writing in this book is well beyond that. It is just gorgeous. It's a really deep, thoughtful, almost literary work, Presumed Innocent. It spent like 50 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. And speaking of the Times, I read a review from the Times that said that the book was a turning point in that it started this movement, this, quote, decades-long process that saw highbrow literature and middlebrow entertainment, once sworn enemies, merge into the hybrid literary world we live in today, in which literary writers routinely use murder mysteries to propel their novels, and genre authors routinely grant their characters elaborate inner struggles to add literary heft to their plots. So next up, we have The Eumenides by Aeschylus, which is the last play in the Oresteia, which I'm sure many of you have read parts of this in high school or maybe in college. I would recommend this edition if you get the chance, which is the one that Harold Bloom recommends. So this is the ancient Greek playwright Aeschylus. So the Oresteia was written in 458 BC, and it consists of the 3 linked plays that are part of this tragic trilogy: Agamemnon, the Libation Bearers, and lastly, obviously, the Eumenides, which is the one that we're going to look at. So the Oresteia centers on the house of Atreus, the family of Agamemnon and Menelaus, and the hereditary curse that that looms over their house. The idea of the hereditary curse in ancient Greece is that moral guilt is inheritable. So if a man does something dishonorable or terrible, that will affect his offspring, and they'll have to pay for his deeds, for what he did. So the curse didn't start with Agamemnon, but rather his great-grandfather, Tantalus. So the curse is passed down through the generations, and this brings us to Agamemnon, a son of Atreus, who must face this long curse. And so the first book of the Oresteia, Agamemnon, is about his return to his palace after the Trojan War and his murder by his wife Clytemnestra. Clytemnestra took Agamemnon's cousin Aegisthus as a lover while he was away, and they decide to plot to kill Agamemnon when he gets back from the Trojan War, so that Aegisthus can take the throne of Argos. So Clytemnestra kills her husband with an axe while he's taking a bath, and she claims that the murder is justified since it avenges his crime of cheating on her with Cassandra, and she claims it will put an end to the cycle of violence and vengeance brought on by the curse. So she claims she's doing a good thing. The second play, The Libation Bearers, takes place years after the murder and is about the reunion of Agamemnon's kids, Electra and Orestes, and the revenge that they take against their mother and her lover. So Orestes takes vengeance against his uncle Aegisthus, and he kills him. And then after much begging and pleading on the part of Clytemnestra, he seizes her and kills her too, at which point he proclaims that justice has been served. He says, and this is a direct quote, "Be my witness if I'm ever tried. It was right to seek the penalty of death for her. Aegisthus's death is simply the law, since he debauched somebody's wife. She plotted hatefully against her husband." But then the Furies appear and curse Orestes for killing his mother, which they say is an unforgivable crime, far worse than her crime, at which point Orestes flees Argos in a fit of madness. The Furies, by the way, I should say, were goddesses of vengeance and retribution who punished men for their crimes against the natural order. A victim seeking justice for something could call down a curse on the criminal, and if the crime was bad enough, the Furies would come and curse them. Okay, so that brings us to the one I want to focus on, the Eumenides. The Eumenides means kindly ones, and it refers to the chorus of those Furies I was talking about, who were goddesses of blood vengeance linked to the earth and the underworld. Their job is to oversee oaths, and because of this, they, as I said, have the power to curse and torment anyone who breaks their oaths. And the most important oath violation that they have to police is the killing of a family member, especially one who gave you life. So the Eumenides is about how Orestes is tried before Athena and a jury of Athenians to decide whether his crimes justify the torment of the Furies. And so this is where we get to the legal thriller aspect of the story. As the play begins at the Temple of Delphi, we are thrown into a drama dominated by gods and primal forces. The killing of Clytemnestra has apparently brought 2 generations of gods into this big clash of competing philosophies. Apollo claims to represent the will of his father, Zeus, who decreed that Clytemnestra deserves to die as a just penalty for her murder of her husband. And the Furies, on the other hand, align themselves with a much older order of Earth and its ancient primal forces, which, quote, pays no heed to such abstractions as divine justice. So the Furies refer contemptuously to the Olympians, to the Olympic gods, as younger gods. And they invoke the ancient principle that blood will have blood, which is the idea that the slaying of one's kin must be punished by death. A lot of people assume that the blood will have blood saying comes from Macbeth, but it actually doesn't. It comes from the Eumenides. So here we have a case where even the gods can't agree on what is just, which is really cool in this story, is that there's a big debate here between the gods in terms of what is right. So basically, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, law, and justice, has to adjudicate this trial, this dispute. But she feels that the task is too daunting for her alone, so she calls a panel of 12 Athenian citizens to help decide Orestes' case. And then she, the goddess of justice, will preside over the trial. And what's so brilliant and historically important about this work is that what Aeschylus is really trying to do here is use this myth of family murder and vengeance as a way of talking about 2 different systems of justice. What this play is about is navigating between a system of justice in which a crime like murder is dealt with through blood feuds and vengeance undertaken by private parties, and the system that evolves in the West that we're used to, in which, as a society, we hand over the role of retribution and punishment to a court system or legal body and let the courts take care of justice for us in a neutral way. So Athena's move here represents supposedly the first time any such jury has been convened. It's the foundation, apparently, of the jury trial system, which gives ordinary mortals the power to determine facts, to use their reason, to distinguish right from wrong. And so Orestes in this play becomes the first ever defendant on a murder charge in the first ever court trial ever held. And so this really is the first legal thriller in Western literature. So during the trial, Apollo is tasked with speaking on behalf of Orestes, while the Furies are advocates for the dead Clytemnestra. And I won't tell you what happens in the trial, but There's a lesson to be learned here in this play, and it's a profound one. And Aeschylus is really doing something clever with this work, if you think about it. He uses the current court system of his own time, backreads it into mythic time, and gives this new system of justice that his own culture has developed a foundation myth and a kind of dignity and history that will bestow a mythic nobility on it. All right, so that brings us to number 5, To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. There it is right there. So you guys all know what To Kill a Mockingbird is about. I'm sure that you had to read this in 8th grade or 9th grade. You've definitely seen the film starring Gregory Peck. So in short, the story is set in Macomb, Alabama during the Great Depression, and it's narrated by a young girl named Scout Finch. Her father, Atticus, is a lawyer and a widower, and he's really the story's moral center. And other than that, she has her brother, Jem, their housekeeper and cook, Calpurnia, and their friend Dill. So you get to follow Scout, Jem, and Dill through their rambling Huck Finn childhood as they perform hijinks and mess with the Radleys, sneaking into their yard and obsessing over Boo Radley. Meanwhile, her father, Atticus, agrees to defend a black man named Tom Robinson, who's been falsely accused of raping a poor white girl named Mayella Ewell, which subjects Jem and Scout to abuse from other children, and the family becomes an object of ridicule around town. Even their relatives are accusing them of ruining the family name. So Robinson's trial is set to begin, and when he's put in the local jail, a violent mob shows up to essentially lynch him the night before the trial, and that leads to the famous scene where Atticus faces down the mob the night before the trial's about to start. Jem and Scout show up too. Scout runs out and begins to speak to one of the men, and it's ultimately Scout's innocence and courage that causes the mob ultimately to disperse. At the trial itself, the children sit in the colored balcony with the town's black citizens. I won't spoil the trial here for you because this is a non-spoiler video, but it's one of the best parts. And of course, the themes in this book are overcoming prejudice, understanding where other people are coming from, having empathy and sympathy for people's struggles, and having faith in something like human goodness in a world filled with suspicion and injustice. But what I do want to do at this point is read you a recommendation or a meditation of sorts from one of my good friends. I used to play in a band with this guy, and I've always thought the world of him. His name is Luke Gabordi. I was thinking about making this video, and I had the sudden flash realization that this was Luke's favorite book. In fact, he even named his kid Harper after the author Harper Lee. So I thought I'd share his thoughts with you. I reached out to him. I don't get to see him nearly enough. And it's been like 13 or 14 years since I read this book. And so I thought I would share Luke's thoughts with you since he is kind of the expert. And here's what Luke says. This is what he sent me. To Kill a Mockingbird was a book revered in my childhood home, says Luke. I first read it the summer of 8th grade, and I remember finishing it on the long car ride to New Jersey to visit my grandfather, who I had not seen since my conscious memory began. The book had been in some ways primed to disappoint me. My 2 English teacher parents held it in such high esteem that it could not reasonably have been expected to deliver, but it did. It delivered again in 10th grade English class, then again on the floor of my cousin's house in Salt Lake City as everyone else was clamoring to get out the door for a hike. But I was unwilling to interrupt Atticus as he juxtaposed the sin of a black man having had the unmitigated temerity to feel sorry for a white woman with the absurdity of a community's resolve to hold him accountable for a heinous crime that every member of the gallery could plainly see he was all but physically incapable of having committed. It delivered again, this book, in my mid-20s, and then finally once more this past week as I listened to the pleasant voice of a woman with the hint of a southern accent read the book to me on my commute to and from work. What does it for me about this book? Well, I've always loved the story itself, its suspense, complexity of its characters, and the joy, reverence, anger, and sorrow it's made me feel. I've specifically loved the character of Atticus. I was reminded of how many truths I hold that came from his character. Truths like, the one thing that doesn't abide by majority rule is a person's conscience, or before I can live with other folks, I've got to live with myself. The admiration Miss Maudie and I hold for Atticus, which was best represented by the quote that there are some men in this world who are born to do our unpleasant jobs for us. Your father's one of them. But this time, I saw the book from two new angles. First, the complexity of the man in the crowd has not changed since To Kill a Mockingbird's publication in 1960, and probably never will. People are people, always have been and always will be. And second, that Atticus's view of parenting is something I place great value in. When a child asks you a question, answer him, for goodness sakes, but don't make a production of it, is a nice example among many. People are complex, Luke continues. In our modern, echo chamber-ridden, heavily partisan, line-in-the-sand-drawing iteration of democracy, it's easy to reduce a person to the prefabricated label of the day. But for all of us to, quote, climb into another man's skin and walk around in it, might be the ticket. Walter Cunningham went to jail as a cog in a mob to lynch Tom Robinson. While he's fully responsible for his own choices, the voice of an 8-year-old child reminding him who he is as an individual was not only enough to not have him clear out for the night, but to make his clan of Cunninghams be the longest holdouts in the jury, seeking to acquit the very same man of the crime for which they set out to lynch him. The weakness of the humanity of a town holding both a reverence and silent debt to Atticus in private, while parading their racist views in public. Dolphus Raymond sliding into the role of the town drunk while drinking only Coca-Cola from his paper bag to allow folks an easy explanation for his unconventional family with a black woman. Boo Radley, a misunderstood recluse. Mrs. Dubois, a mean, racist, and hateful woman revealing an honorable character trait before releasing her final breath. And Calpurnia, revealing to Scout a small glimpse of her second persona through her command of a second dialect when she takes the children to church. Luke continues, I love Scout, Jem, and Dill. Through the eyes of the children, Lee distills the social constructs of Maycomb to the innocence of a child's mind, seeking to determine right from wrong. She reveals the complexity of people and reminds us that we're often a product of the world with which we're presented, and that, as Miss Jean Louise Finch succinctly puts it, nah, Jem, I think there's just one kind of folks. Folks. To Lee, the convenient labeling of people as a means to explain away their views dissenting from our own, or to distance ourselves from their distasteful behaviors, is dismissive and lazy. I appreciate from Scout and Nell Harper Lee this timeless reminder. All right, so well said, Luke, and awesome to get that review from him. I haven't seen him in several years, far too long. Thanks for that, Luke. It was beautiful. All right, we're up to number 4, The Trial by Franz Kafka. So definitely the most Kafka-esque of Kafka's great novels. Shout out to the film The Squid and the Whale. If you've seen that film, you'll get the joke. This book was published posthumously in 1925, though it was written in 1914, and it's about the experience of a man who gets caught up in the faceless, unreasoning, absurd bureaucracy of the law. So just a basic plot. On the morning of his 30th birthday, Joseph K., who is the CEO of a bank, is unexpectedly arrested by 2 unidentified agents from an unspecified agency for an unspecified crime that is never actually revealed to K or the reader. So again, Kafka loves doing this. Just like the Metamorphosis, Kafka loves having his characters wake up to some intractable, horrible, existential human dilemma. And the amazing thing about this book is just how true it feels to real life. At the beginning, Kay tries to reason with the people who are arresting him. He says, I don't know the law, which is great because in some ways no one really does know the law. Even in America, as the government grows and as you have bureaucratic agencies making law after law without the public being involved, it's become increasingly true that nobody really does know the law. And even if you did, it wouldn't really make much of a difference, would it? And of course, once you have an unending list of arbitrary laws, that allows government to declare basically anything a crime and then, selectively enforce those laws. It's very much like that quote from that Soviet judge, show me the man and I'll show you the crime, right? It's funny that in 1984, Orwell has the government essentially do the same thing, but in reverse. In Ingsoc, which is the government in 1984, Ingsoc actually has no laws, and that way they can arrest anyone for pretty much anything. So anyways, the protagonist of this book, Kay, isn't imprisoned immediately. He's actually left free and told to await instructions from the Committee of Affairs, which is even more horrifying because he's left waiting anxiously to find out what it is he's done and what's going to happen to him, right? He's just been told he's guilty, and right, he has to kind of figure out why he's guilty and what he's done. All right, so Kay is ordered to appear at the court one day without being told the exact time or room. And after a period of exploring this place, he finds that the court is actually in the attic, which holds miles of bureaucrats stretching out in a maze-like fashion, all stuffed into this weird, dimly lit room. So anyhow, when he finally finds the room he's supposed to be in and he gets where he's supposed to go, he is severely reprimanded for his tardiness. Again, he wasn't told what time to show up. And so he makes a passionate plea about the absurdity of the trial and the emptiness of their accusations. What is going on? And yet none of this has any impact. Even when he enlists an aged lawyer, the guy tells him that the, quote, gradations and ranks of the courts are infinite, and that essentially the judges here are very low ranking and have really no ability to sway the outcome for him. So I won't spoil the good stuff here in this book, but I'll just say that the rest of the story follows Kay through his debacle as he struggles against the law and the court to resolve these charges against him, meanwhile getting stuck in this absurd existential labyrinth network of bureaucratic traps, maintaining his innocence, all the while somehow absurdly looking guiltier and guiltier as the trial goes on. So basically, the whole thing has this very Severance feel to it. I don't know if you guys have seen the Apple show by Ben Stiller, Severance. It may be my favorite show running today. It probably is. And the themes are really the same, even though it's a private company. The authorities at this company are shadowy. There's this whole absurdist feel to it. People get lost in the hallways all the time, and no one knows what the company does or even really what the rules are, or even what the point of the company is. So why should you read this book? Well, one British critic said that Kafka's genius was that his stories build up these parables and metaphors that illustrate, quote, remoteness, hopelessness, and the impossibility of access to sources of authority or certainty, which very much resonates with, I think, the state of things right now, the way in which people don't really know where to turn for reliable information, right? Like, which institutions can I count on to not be corrupt? Is there any epistemological certainty when so much information seems to be propaganda and our sense-making institutions have become so corrupt? Is anyone actually competent steering the ship? And as a result of not receiving satisfactory answers to these questions, we feel very much adrift and unmoored and absurd, lost in a Kafka-esque labyrinth. Another thing I'll say is that this novel gave rise to the fallacy of the Kafka trap. A Kafka trap, if you didn't know, is when someone takes your denial that you've done something wrong as evidence or proof of your guilt, right? So if someone accuses you of, I don't know, being a thief, and you say, I'm certainly not the thief, I wasn't even there when it happened. A Kafka trap would be, oh yeah? Well, that's exactly what a thief would say. Or more recently, you can use this modern example when someone spuriously accuses another person of, I don't know, like being racist without evidence. The person will, of course, deny it and say, I'm not a racist. And a Kafka trap in this case would be when the accuser says, well, denying your inherent racism is itself racist. So don't fall for Kafka traps is the lesson here. Up next, Merchant of Venice by William Shakespeare. So I haven't read this play since college when I took a Shakespeare course for my graduate degree, but I remember how much this play stuck with me, not just because I'm Jewish, but because of how powerful the play is. Though as an English teacher, I still haven't had a chance yet to teach this. The play is about Antonio, who is an anti-Semitic merchant who has to take a loan from the Jew Shylock to help his friend court the rich, beautiful, and intelligent Portia. Antonio can't repay the loan, and without mercy, Shylock decides to demand a pound of his flesh. So ultimately, the heiress Portia, now the wife of Antonio's friend, dresses as a lawyer and saves Antonio. So I was going over my notes from college, and I was thinking about what to say about this book, and I realized that my colleague and good friend Steve actually teaches this book every year to his Shakespeare class. He is the Shakespeare teacher at my school. So I asked Steve, what is it that you love about Merchant of Venice, and what do you think is most compelling about its exploration of justice? And this is what my good friend, the Shakespeare expert, Steve Smith, wrote. While certainly not a courtroom thriller, Shakespeare does set the most memorable and important scene in the Duke's court, where the Jewish moneylender Shylock is seeking redress from the titular merchant Antonio. It's filled with tension, explores the concepts of justice and mercy, and ends in heartbreak. Shylock, who can be labeled villain, victim, or both, sees the law and the terms of a contract as the means to exact revenge upon the man who's personally mistreated him, spitting upon him in the street simply for being Jewish, and who represents the Christian ruling class that discriminates against Shylock and denies him citizenship. Shylock wants the court to honor a clause that he initially inserts into his contract with Antonio as a kind of a joke, that non-payment results in Shylock being entitled to a pound of Antonio's flesh. Bassanio's wife, Portia, who masquerades as the male lawyer Balthazar, peruses the contract and says that, quote, the Jew must be merciful. From here, the scene is a brilliant meditation upon the idea that the law is not always moral. Portia instructs that the quality of mercy is not strained, that it is an attribute of God himself, and that we do pray for mercy, and that same prayer doth teach us all to render the deeds of mercy. Shylock, on the other hand, isn't having it, stating, quote, I crave the law. He refuses to take the money offered by Bassanio, even when the payment due is doubled and then multiplied tenfold. He wants his vengeance, secured by the law as justice. He won't budge. Then the twist. Shylock can have his pound of flesh, but no blood, not a drop, and not an ounce more or less than an exact pound. Otherwise, Shylock faces a death sentence. When he recognizes the trap he's stepped into, he tries to back down, only for Portia to remind him that he still faces death for threatening a Christian's life. That reminder about mercy? It is discarded once the balance of power has changed hands. Shylock may have his life if he gives up his wealth, half to the state, half to Antonio, who pledges it to Shylock's daughter, and if he converts to Christianity. The wheels of justice have turned, but is it just and is it moral? He loses his business and his very identity. He is a broken man. In the end, Shylock seeks to use the law to exact his revenge, and the law ends up destroying him. Neither the approach nor the outcome has the weight of morality. So what is justice? The courtroom, as it turns out, isn't always the place to find it. All right, so an excellent summary there by my good buddy Steve Smith. And that brings us to Bleak House by Charles Dickens. So the book begins with a case in the Chancery Court in London called Jarndyce and Jarndyce, which is deliberate because it obviously sounds like jaundice, which is Dickens's way of criticizing the legal system. In fact, early in his career, Dickens was actually a reporter writing regularly on the Chancery Court. So the case in this story is about a huge estate, which, if settled, would bequeath whoever would get the money, like millions and millions of pounds. But it's been dragging on for years, and the case itself is consuming, of course, the money from the estate and the wills, slowly eating it away over the years to pay for all of the legal fees as this whole thing gets slowly adjudicated. And that was something that Dickens had actually experienced, where you'd have, someone get an inheritance, 300 pounds or something, and 2/3 of it would get eaten up by the lawyers and other officials, everyone trying to get a little piece of the action. So something is obviously wrong with the legal system in England and in the West in general, and that's what Dickens is criticizing. In fact, one of the more memorable quotes from the book is, quote, "The one great principle of the English law is to make business for itself. There is no other principle distinctly, certainly, and consistently maintained through all its narrow turnings. Viewed by this light, it becomes a coherent scheme, and not the monstrous maze the laity are apt to think it. Let them but once clearly perceive that its grand principle is to make business for itself at their expense, and surely they will cease to grumble." So the purpose of the legal system is not to exact justice or find the truth. It is to make money for itself. This is ultimately the crux of the story. The whole thing is magnificently complex. There are about 5 major stories all interwoven here, and it would be difficult to say which the main story is, because it's a really complex book. Each is interconnected and related to the case of Jarndyce. And Jarndyce, the biting and hilarious satirical criticism of the legal system and the fact that very little has really changed when it comes down to it, was definitely one of the most enjoyable aspects of this book. Added to that, there are several subplots too, which are connected to the main theme, though they do branch out. So poverty is one of the main themes, especially the plight of poor children who are abandoned or orphaned. We're used to that with Dickens. You get that in the subplot of Joe. Love and duty are another theme, and you get that through the characters of Esther, John Jarndyce, and Ada. There's the contrasting themes of antiquity and tradition, represented by Sir Leicester Dedlock, set against the ever-encroaching progress of the industrial age, represented by Watt Rouncewell. What an appropriate first name, Watt. There's even a bit of creeping, faint criticism of the French Revolution and revolution in general, just subtextually looming in the background of the story as well. You've got the theme of unhappy families. Philanthropy is another theme, both real, selfless, disinterested philanthropy, and the kind, too, that is basically just done for show. One example of this is, one of my favorite chapters in this book is the chapter is titled Telescopic Philanthropy, and it's about this woman, Mrs. Jellyby, who is obsessed with Africa and saving Africa. It's all she talks about. She's always going on about her African project, bragging about how much she does for the welfare of Africans, educating the natives and adopting families and cultivating coffee farms. And anyone who interacts with her has to hear about how gratifying the work is and how it takes up all of her time. Meanwhile, she is pretty much rude to everyone around her, and she neglects the people in her life, never really attending to the problems in her own home. And I think we all know people like this who are obsessed with national problems or world problems that are really far away, and they're kind of hyper-focused on that. And then when you interact with, and they act like they're really moral because of their concern for these issues. And then when you actually get to know them, they're really not pleasant to be around, and they kind of treat the people around them in this kind of neglectful, shabby way. So even though the themes of greed and corruption in this book are serious, we do get plenty of comic characters to lighten the mood. And I know some people criticize Bleak House for having so many characters. This is a very large book after all. But Dickens does a good job of tagging his characters, which is something he's good at, with memorable lines and personality quirks. You have Joe, the crossing sweeper who don't know no-think. The fashionable Mrs. Dedlock, who is bored with life, bored with myself, right? She is always complaining about that. Mrs. Flight, who constantly is expecting a judgment shortly. John Jarndyce, who's to be avoided when the wind is in the east. There is Harold Skimpole, who is always protesting that he's but a child in matters of money. So Dickens is good at doing that, just giving his characters really interesting and evocative names and carefully implanting little character tags to jog our memories. My favorite character, though, probably was Esther Summerson, this poor, self-effacing girl who's just constantly feeling guilty for having been born at all in the first place, feeling that her birthday was the most melancholy in the whole year. About half of the story is told from Esther's perspective, and I find it interesting that modern readers don't really like her as a female character because she's so modest and unconfident, always making it clear how unworthy she is, how unattractive and dull she is compared with her peers. But I thought she was great and super relatable. In fact, I was thinking the entire time that her self-depreciating quality was probably just a defense mechanism. I'm pretty sure she was modeled on Dickens's wife's youngest sister. Anyways, nearly all of the lives of these characters seem to be unfulfilled in this story. And we get the sense that most of these characters are really people who are just trapped by their circumstances. So definitely give that one a read, one of Dickens's best, brilliantly written. And that brings us to number 1 on the list, and that is The Apology by Plato. So the Apology is an account of the speech that Socrates makes at the trial that he has to undergo. He's put to trial by the democratic government of Athens. He has been charged with not recognizing the gods, the Greek pantheon of gods that the state wants him to recognize. He's being charged with inventing new deities and with corrupting the youth of Athens by teaching them to doubt essentially the status quo. There's a deeper reason that historians think that Socrates was probably brought to trial, and that has to do with the reign of the 30 tyrants and the fact that Socrates never left the city, and so the government thought that he was in league with the 30 tyrants, which was an oligarchy, and so and they knew that Socrates was famously against democracy, so they were threatened by him. So there were deeper political reasons for charging Socrates, bringing him to court. But this is part of a cycle of Platonic dialogues that starts with the Euthyphro. The Euthyphro is the dialogue where Socrates is standing outside of the Athenian courthouse, and he's having a debate with Euthyphro. So you get the Euthyphro dilemma. The Apology is when he goes into court and defends himself. By the way, his speech is by no means an apology in the sense that we usually think of the word. The name of the dialogue comes from the Greek apologeia, which means a defense or speech made in one's own defense, right? So in the Apology, Socrates is actually attempting to defend himself and his conduct rather than apologizing for it. So, and then after the Apology is the Crito, and that is when Crito bribes the guards and gets into Socrates' prison cell and tries to get him to break out. And Socrates debates with Crito and says that he refuses to break the laws of Athens, even though refusing to do so will result in his death. And then the cycle ends with the Phaedo, which is Socrates' argument for the immortality of the soul, and this takes place after his death. So what is this dialogue about? When Socrates stands up to defend himself, he explains that the reason that he's been engaging in behavior that the state thinks is very strange all stems from a prophecy by the oracle at Delphi, which claimed that Socrates was the wisest of all men. And Socrates, being very humble, says, quote, "When I heard the answer, I said to myself, what can the god mean? And what is the interpretation of this riddle, this enigma? For I know that I have no wisdom, Sophia." So that's where we get the word philosophy, philo, the love of, Sophia, wisdom. Socrates says, "For I have no wisdom, Sophia, small or great. So what can the oracle mean when he says that I am the wisest, most sophos of men? And yet he is a god and cannot lie. That would be against his nature." After a long consideration, Socrates says, "I at last thought of a method of trying the question. I reflected that if I could only find a man more sophos than myself, then I might go to the god with a refutation of the oracle in my hand. I should say to him, 'Here is a man more sophos than I am, but you said that I was the most sophos.'" And so basically, here's the deal with this. Socrates goes to the oracle at Delphi. The oracle tells him, "You are the wisest man out there," and Socrates doesn't believe him. So Socrates decides that he is going to walk around and interact with different people, engage them in the Socratic method, and try to see if he can find someone who is more wise than himself. Because Socrates famously is the guy who knows only one thing, and that is that he knows nothing. So he wants to go around and interview people and talk to them and see if the oracles are, if he can prove them wrong. So Socrates decides to go to different classes of people. First, he approaches the politicians. And the politicians, he notices, they think they're wise and that they know everything. But really, they only know how to fool other people and even themselves into thinking that they're wise. That's the politician's skill. Politicians are basically smooth-talking con men that are very good at making other people think that they're wise and virtuous and noble. So then, secondly, Socrates approaches the poets. He says, okay, the politicians obviously aren't wise. Maybe the poets. They're very smart and brilliant and artistic. So he approaches the poets, and the poets, they're fantastic, but they're not really wise, he notices. They're more like diviners, right? The poets, the musicians, the painters, the dancers of the world, they are inspired creators who have the ability to translate their feelings, their deepest, most profound emotions into art that moves people. But they don't always fully understand what it is that they've even created. And this is really interesting. I think Plato here is really getting at something about the nature of creativity. So, by the way, this dialogue is by Plato. So I just want to make one thing clear here. All of Plato's dialogues, or at least most of them, they're written obviously by Plato, but the main character of these dialogues is Socrates. So he is writing dialogues from the perspective of his teacher, going around and having discussions with people. That's what a Platonic dialogue essentially is. So again, I love this discussion about the nature of creativity. When inspired creators create art, whether it's poetry or music or literature or painting, there's a sense in which even they themselves aren't coming up with the ideas. Often the first question that fans will ask an artist or a musician or a novelist is, where do you come up with your ideas? Where do you get your ideas? And typically the artist will say, I don't know, they just come to me. And this is usually right. There's a sense in which the artist is not so much originating the ideas as being open to receiving them. So this is where the idea of the muse comes in. This god that supplies artists with ideas, and the artist is almost the one who is best at hearing the muse and then transcribing what the muse offers them, right? Artists, that is, have a way of being open with their feelings. They have a way of receiving certain ideas and not getting in the way of them, right? Letting them kind of flow through them and out of their fingers or their voice or whatever the case may be. This is why oftentimes philosophers and literary critics don't actually make good novelists. They're too analytical. They can't shut down their reasoning minds and allow their intuitions to work free like artists can. But Socrates seems to be saying here that while artists may be good at what they do, they're not so much wise. It's a different kind of genius that artists have. So then Socrates decides to go to the artisans, the politicians, the poets. They aren't wise. Maybe the artisans who know and make many fine things, maybe they will be wise. And they did. They had a kind of sophos when it came to their craft, when it came to their art, what they were good at. This is kind of sovereignty versus wisdom. But the artisans, and this is a quote by Plato, the artisans fell into the same error, hamartia, as the poets. Because they were good workmen, they thought that they also knew all sorts of high matters. This defect in them overshadowed their Sophia. So this is where Socrates concludes that he's not so much wiser than men, but he's wiser than men in that he knows, and he seems to be the only one who knows, that he knows nothing. He's the only person who's modest about his wisdom. So in order to spread this idea, this epistemological humility, Socrates explains that he considered it his duty to question supposed wise men and expose their false wisdom as ignorance. So he explains to the court, this is why I've been going around Athens in my toga and my sandals and debating with people. This is why I've been engaging in dialogue with the youths of Athens. And so in a very famous passage, Socrates likens himself to a gadfly, stinging the lazy horse which is the Athenian state. And this is the ultimate defense of the philosopher. This is the philosopher's defense of the discipline of philosophy and critical inquiry and the importance of the philosopher. Socrates says, without him, the state of Athens is liable to drift into a deep sleep. But through his influence, irritating as it may be to some, the state, through enough conversation and free speech, can be wakened into productive and virtuous action. It is often deemed unpopular, pretentious, or even silly to ask certain questions, big life questions, controversial questions. Some questions don't seem very practical or maybe considered taboo or inappropriate in society. But all free societies, Socrates argues, need philosophers, people who aren't afraid to ask these sorts of big questions. So at the end of this, Socrates is found guilty by a narrow margin, and he's asked to propose a penalty, and ultimately Socrates jokes that what he really deserves to be is honored with a great medal for being such a service to the state. They offer him instead to be ostracized, which is an exile of 10 years, as it was in ancient Greece. But Socrates rejected both prison time and exile. And when Socrates put forth the idea, maybe I could just pay a fine, the jury rejected his suggestion and decided that he was being impetuous and sentenced him to death. So the ending of the story here is that Socrates stoically accepts the verdict and says bravely that no one but the gods know what happens after death, and so it would be foolish to fear what one does not know. And he also warns the jurymen who voted against him that in silencing their critic rather than listening to him, they have harmed themselves much more than they could ever harm him. And he says something to the effect of that he will spend the afterlife debating people to figure out whether they are wise. Even after he's dead, he's going to be there engaging in the Socratic method with other people. So that is that is number one for me as a philosopher. I can't recommend The Apology enough. Okay, we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you for watching. Join us on Facebook, Goodreads, Tip Your Starving Booktuber on Patreon. Check us out on Instagram. And until next time, happy reading. Bye-bye.